Good evening, everyone. How are you?
We're very well, thank you.
We certainly
And
are. Yeah,
Martin.
great to be with you.
So I'm just delighted that you could join us in your honor. I have made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, but I hope you're going to drink something since this evening in your time, something more wonderful. So I thought it would be really lovely to talk to you about your two new books, Mortmain Hall by Martin, which it's going to blur. There we go. Hold up. And for Anne Cleeves, The Darkest Evening. This is my review copy, Anne, because we have sold out every single copy of your book.
I love to hear that.
Well, it's been a wild success. So I'm hoping you will talk to each other, but I did have a general question for both of you, and it's come up with several authors that we've been talking to in the last few months, which is that there's been this renaissance of Agatha Christie, whether the Country House Murder and Then They Were None, which has been a design for several current mysteries, very much updated. And so each of you in these books that I just mentioned, there's a country house that figures quite prominently. Although Martin's, I think, may have more Edgar Allan Poe in it than Agatha Christie, but still. And interestingly, Val McDermott's new book, Anne Still Life, which is a different police procedural, has again a country house. So I guess the question is, why do you think that we've all kind of taken up Christie, or at least her classic structures again? Whoever wants to go first, Anne?
Well, I started writing about the country house here because I bought this cottage in the hills and it's very close to a big country house with a very eccentric family living in it. And the cottage actually used to belong to the house and was where the workers lived. And Northumberland, this part of Northumberland is very, very feudal. So that the cottage next door still belongs to the big house and is lived in by the huntsman who runs the hunt that is attached to the house. And although I've got to know the people in the big house very well, they're not at all like the characters in the book. But it did give me that impetus, that interest, that curiosity at looking at the relationship between the people who live in the big house but who have those responsibilities and obligations. And so it's a vehicle for looking at the English class system, but it's also quite fun if you're writing a Christmas, winter murder mystery to play with the idea of the big country house as well.
It is a lot of fun. Vera, I think, is an interesting character to have put into it, but we'll come back to that. Sorry, Martin, carry on.
Yes, I agree with that. I emailed Anne the other day just to amuse her because I'd found one of my earliest detective stories written at the age of 10, which turns out to be a Christmas country house mystery set in Northumberland, Mystery at Fallow Grange. Astonishingly, it was never published and indeed never sent to a publisher, which is just as well for my subsequent career, I think. But it at least indicates that I've been interested in this type of fiction for a very, very long time, even though I've not really written this kind of story in the past. My first series was set in Liverpool, in contemporary Liverpool, and the second series in the rural backwaters of the Lake District. But the new series with Rachel Savanague and Jacob Flint, of which this is the second book, the follow-up to Gallows Court, is set in 1930. And it's very much a series of books that pays tribute to Golden Age detective fiction, but also tries to offer a fresh take on Golden Age detective stories. Gallows Court did it in a very different way. It was more of a thriller with nods to the Golden Age. Mortmain Hall is much more like a classic detective story, but with a number of differences. But
yeah, I think Martin and I have been friends for a long time, and I think I did prompt you some years ago and said, you've got this passion about Golden Age murder mysteries. Why don't you write one? If you remember.
Well, that's...
It took a while to take my advice.
I certainly, but of course I always do take your advice in the end, as you know. But you're right, and of course that conversation, which I remember well, came out of books and other things I was doing in relation to non-fiction, in relation to Golden Age, which has always been a love of mine since I discovered Agatha Christie at the age of 8, and it was a good idea, and I wasn't really sure how I would go about it. So Gallows Court was, as I say, a different sort of Golden Age murder mystery. Lots of murders, lots of mystery, but not a conventional detective story. Mortmain Hall is much more like that kind of country house story, with the suspects gathered at the end in the library and the final dramatic revelations. So it's much more in the vein of the Agatha Christie type of story, I think.
And I really love police procedurals. And to be honest, there are so many domestic dramas coming from England that I fall upon a more classic form or procedural with enormous glee. But I wonder, what is it that makes it so interesting to you? Because in the Shetland books, and then you started a new series set in Southern England, in Devon, right?
In North Devon.
And now, and then of course with Vera, what is it that interests you about following an investigation?
I think partly because I'm not very good at plotting, so it does give me that structure. There's that line to follow, and I love following the investigations along with the detectives because I don't plot in advance. So I find out who's done it at about the same time as Vera does, so it makes it quite fun. But also I think what a police series does, it gives you the opportunity to look at relationships within the police team. And I like that idea of a team which almost becomes a family. You know, I don't write domestic noir, but I do explore relationships within the family, within the police team. And if you've got a series, that can develop over a number of books, I think.
Yeah,
well, I do think the ensemble cast is very appealing to people reading series. You know, they get attached not just to the main characters, but to others. And certainly that's true in the Vera Stanhopes, because you've got those other characters that people want to follow and see how their lives are developing. I'm sorry, Martin, I keep interrupting you. So did you have something you wanted to say?
No, not at all. I think that is one of the many strengths of Anne's books, that you get this sense of community, whether it's the Northumberland country house community and the surroundings in the darkest evening, or the sense of community within the police team. And this idea of looking at the police detectives, not just from the point of view of the procedure. I think it's fair to say that neither Anne nor I in my Lake District books really focus on procedural detail, but it's more about the way the members of the team interrelate, the characters. The next Lake District book, which I finished very recently, as you know, Barbara, that focuses on the relationship between the detectives and the police and crime commissioner, which is a relatively new post at the top of regional police forces. So I too, in my way, like to explore those internal tensions within the cast of characters in the police series.
Yeah, I think in the long call, what I loved about writing that is that it is much more an ensemble piece. So with the Vera books, Vera is the central character and she really carries the story all the way through. But with Matthew Venn, I've got a whole team who I think are interesting in their own right. Each of the members, I think, will continue to develop and to play a role. And it's the first time for ages as I've written a happy marriage. So I love writing a happy marriage too, between Jonathan and Matthew. So that was good fun to do.
Yeah.
So I guess the question arises, if you are writing a police procedural, how much do you need to know about how the police actually work? And I'm thinking back to Robert Barnard, how I loved Robert Barnard, a truly original mind. And I remember him saying, maybe it was at St. Hilda's at a mystery conference, that Christiana Brand, who did write some police procedurals, used to finesse the whole thing by saying, and the police pursued their meticulous investigations. And that was the entire sum of what she put in about procedure. But you two are much more detailed than that. So how do you go about it?
Well, we do our research, don't we? And we both have friends who are experts in forensics. But it's to me, it's more a question of emphasis. With some series, including some fantastic series, the emphasis is very much on the investigative process and how that works. I think with Anne and I, in our different ways, it is more about the characters within the investigating team and the relationships between them and between them and outsiders, how they interact with the suspects, that kind of thing. So there is research to be done, but it's of a different kind, and it is important, I think, to get that research right. But different types of crime writers. Bob Barnard, you mentioned, was a good example. Bob did very little research because he wasn't particularly looking for factual accuracy. He was trying to tell a witty and engaging mystery in the classic tradition. But I think with Anne and I, we and I won't speak too much for her. She can certainly speak for herself. But we do the research that we think is necessary, and it's important to get it right. But it doesn't overwhelm the book. It's not the key focus of the book.
Yeah, I think if you followed accurately what a police investigation would be like, it would be really, really boring, because it would be very slow. It takes days to get toxicology tests back. You've got a much bigger team than you have in the books, I think. So I will throw in a few details to bring it to life, to give it a bit of realism. And for that, I have 3 friends who are brilliant, and I can phone them up. What would a body look like if it's been in a reservoir for 20 years? Or how would you be able to tell about a victim from a bunch of bones in a culvert? And it's that sort of detail that readers actually quite like, because it makes it sound as if you know what you're doing. And the rest of it you can wing quite happily, because people focus on the one detail that you've put in. The rest of it you can just make up, really, I think.
So you've had policing in Scotland with your Shetland series, and now you have policing in Northumbria, policing in Devon and all. Are there differences? Or is
there are in Scotland, No, there are in Scotland. Scotland's got a different legal system, which I'm sure Martin could tell us about, as he's a lawyer. But there is no coroner's court, for instance, in Scotland. It's quite easy to make mistakes. You have to be quite careful not to get things wrong, because the legal system is very different. And I think they've got a rule of collaboration, so you have to have 2 officers getting confessions and getting witness statements and for pieces of evidence. So it is a bit different, but the whole of England is all under the same jurisdiction. We don't have separate, like I guess you do in the States, where with your states might have different rules and regulations. Ours is all the same.
That's right. So the differences in England would tend to be between the nature of the area. So policing in central Liverpool would be a different thing in many ways from policing in a predominantly rural area like Northumberland or the Lake District. That would be the nature of the communities that are served by the police that would make the difference, rather than the rules and regulations.
And that takes us back to human geography, doesn't it, Martin? Which is something that we've been discussing quite a lot recently.
Yes. Shall we talk about that?
We can talk about that. That's a good thing to talk about. My daughter's an academic. She's a human geographer. At the moment, she's panicking because she's trying to get her course COVID secure for the students who are just about to arrive. And the management of the university keep changing the rules. But her line of research is looking at the individual within its community. So a geographer, but very much focused on people. And I think that's what I do as a writer. I'm very interested in community and how landscape shapes the people, the characters who are there. and I think also within crime fiction, the landscape and the particular part of the country that you're in affects the story too. And as Martin said, policing is very different in different areas, but crime might be different, and the way people look at crime too. So
Yeah.
I wrote an essay for a book that Martin's just edited about human geography.
That's right, and that's a book which perhaps we might talk about a little bit. It comes out in the States in a few weeks' time. It's just come out in Britain, but it's a book called How Done It, and it's a book that I've edited, but the contributors are 90 members of the Detection Club, which this year celebrates its 90th birthday. Not that it's actually been able to do much celebrating because of the pandemic, of course, so I'll have to put it off to year 91. But the idea was to raise funds for the Detection Club, which has always lived on the brink of insolvency throughout its long existence. The club being a small social network, a dining club that began in the days of Chesterton and Dorothy L. Sayers and Agatha Christie. All three of whom were presidents of the club. And from time to time, the club has published books to raise funds to enable it to keep going. And so at the start of last year, I suggested to the members that we might put together a little book, which would be about the technique of crime writing and insights into the crime writer's life. And I got a favourable response from a number of members, including Anne, who, efficient as always, was one of the very, very first people to send in her contribution. And it really snowballed from there. And in the end, almost every living member of the club has contributed. It's dedicated to Len Dayton, who celebrates this year 50 years as a member of the club, and has written a fantastic essay. There are pieces by John le Carré, Ian Rankin, Val McDermid, Sophie Hannah, Ellie Griffiths, and many, many more, as well as some of the great names of the past whose estates and agents were willing to contribute. And all of them, every single person, very generously did it for free to contribute to club funds to keep the club alive. And the result is a much bigger book than I ever expected, with all these contributions. But I think, though I say it myself, it's quite wonderful because it ranges so widely and gives really unique insights into not just approaches to writing. And Anne has talked about human geography, P.D. James, there's a section about her approach to writing landscape. But then you have Stella Duffy talking about improvisation, Peter James talking about motivation for writers, Ian Rankin talking about the value of crime fiction, Mark Billingham comparing his life as a stand-up comic to his approach to crime writing. Tips, techniques, insights. Even I like to think if you wouldn't dream of writing a crime story, I think there's a lot in the book that you'll find quite fascinating. And certainly, as I received this torrent of manuscripts, it was an absolute joy to read them, and I learned a lot myself. So that's How Done It. It, as I say, has just been published in Britain, and it comes out in the States in a few weeks' time.
Yes, we've actually been promoting it, and I do think that it's wonderful. You also have a collection of short fiction that I can't remember what it is, coming out as well from a different publisher. I'll have to look it up. You're so prolific, Martin. It's really hard to keep track of you.
Well, I'm not.
It's because he's got a wonderful wife who does everything else for him.
Well, that's certainly true. And I'm the first to admit it. But I'm not a particularly prolific novelist. I've just finished the 20th novel, and the first one was published almost 30 years ago. So in terms of novels, I don't produce them even at the rate of one a year. But I have edited a lot of anthologies, both in the British Library Crime Classics series, which of course Poison Pen has been publishing in the States, the Crime Writers Association anthologies, and then occasional books of non-fiction like The Golden Age of Murder. So when you add all those up, it looks as though I've been perhaps more industrious than I really am.
Well, you have had a full law practice, so, you know, I think we have to allow for the fact that you were not idle, but, you know, doing other things. I'm sorry, Anne, I interrupted you. What were you going to say?
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, Anne, because, you know, you are a prolific writer and move back and forth. Although, how are you feeling about having let Shetland go? I mean, was that an easy decision for you, or was that a bit of a sad one?
Yeah, it was sad, but it was the right time to do it, I think. There were 8 books. There are only 23,000 people who live in Shetland. And if we're looking at human geography again, the landscape is very similar. And I think I'd explored all the different communities within the island. So people, you know, people who worked with the fishing and people who crofted, and I'd looked at that. And I didn't want to carry on to be bored writing, and certainly I didn't want readers to be bored reading. So I think I finished at just the right time. Yeah. For people who enjoy the TV show, that will continue for a while at least. They'll be filming again in Shetland early next year. They were up, ready to film when the lockdown happened with us and everybody had to stop working. But
it's interesting how TV can kind of shows can take on a life of their own. I wrote to you that I was so surprised to see Douglas Henshaw as an evil marauder in Outlander. We were watching along, and Rob said to me, my husband said, "What is the Shetler guy doing in this story?" And I think we often forget how small a community of actors, you know, there may be, and so you have to.
That's right. Stephen Robertson, who plays Sandy in Shetland, and who is a Shetlander who lives in. He's just gone back with his family to live in Shetland. He appeared in one of the episodes of Vera, which was quite bewildering to see him, and with a Geordie accent, playing just beautifully acted, actually, a young man with learning disability in Vera. But it was as if my two worlds had collided to see him in the show.
Do the actors' performances in any way affect how you end up viewing your characters or write them?
Not with Shetland, I think, because Dougie looks so different from the Jimmy Perez of the books, who has the Spanish dark good looks and is quite different from Dougie Henshall. But Vera, I think Brenda has taken on that role with such aplomb and with such gusto that I certainly hear her voice when I'm writing dialogue for the Vera books. I write a piece and I'll think, oh, I hope the scriptwriter keeps that in, because Brenda will love saying that. So she does that sarcasm and that wit so well and loves playing it. Yesterday I was sat here with Zoom looking at the first read through of the new series of Vera for the television, because despite the restrictions and the COVID, they are going to start filming on Monday. So instead of everybody sitting around a big table and reading through the first script, which is a lovely ritual and to which I always get invited, and I always try to go if I can because it's a great way of meeting the team, we did it all on Zoom and waved at each other while they read, because I think it's going to be very difficult for them to work in location and in the studio. Well, it'll take longer than usual, I think.
It's wonderful to know that there will be more Vera. We watch it over here very often on BritBox.
Yes.
And you know, it's fun to see her because it's her face that comes up, and you're right, her voice. So now that you've had 2 series, do you think that having written your Devon books that there will be an interest in, once there's probably more than 1 book, in filming that too?
Well, there's been an option. So the team that make Vera and Shetland have taken out an option on the 2 Rivers, the Matthew Venn books. Whether it'll actually happen, because I'm sure Martin will have told you as well that options happen quite often and they're not always commissioned. I think the fact that the 2 previous series have been quite successful makes me reasonably optimistic that something might happen eventually, but not quite yet.
That would be wonderful. There's a new one, and I've forgotten the name, but we watched the other night, that is set in Bath. It's not Peter Lovesey, but I think not based on books. But one of the things that came up watching it was the, excuse me, rather paramilitary structure of the police. And I wonder, they seem to have a chain of command that's fairly strict. And I wonder, is that generally true, or is that, Martin, is that just done for television and it doesn't really work that way?
Well, there are significant differences, but historically, if you go back to the 20s and the 30s, there was a lot of tension when military ex First World War senior officers were brought in at senior levels in the police to try to smarten things up, so to speak. So there is a historic tension there, as well as a bit of an influence from the military, but it's a very long time ago. And of course nowadays there's a huge distinction between the military and the police in Britain.
So I was interested to see that Collins, known over here as Harper, but I always call them Collins in the UK, has amazing vaults that they are able to draw upon. They've been reproducing or reissuing a lot of classics, but all of a sudden Reginald Hill books are back on their schedule. And that, I think, might have some real impact on your own Lake series, because you and I just finished editing a new Lake District mystery, which I really enjoyed. It's been some time since the last one came out, but I'm also wondering if reissuing classics is going to have a positive effect, more modern, but similar kinds of, at least geographically similar, if not otherwise similar. What do you think?
Well, it may do. And I mean, we mentioned Reg Hill, who is a good friend of yours and Anne's, and was a great friend of mine as well. And he was always someone who was a bit of a mentor to me. I talked to him whenever I got the chance, really, to pick his brains. He was not only about the wittiest person I've ever met, he was a very wise man. And he encouraged me to vary the kind of books that I wrote, and gave me a lot of encouragement in my early years, when I was starting out in the 1990s. And I talked to him about the Lake District series when I was first contemplating it. And he said that he was going to, he actually lived in the Lake District at this time. He said he was going to write a book, but he said, but don't worry, it's a one-off. And it was a very good book called Stranger House. And he encouraged me to write about the area, taught to me about the nature of Lake District life. And as you know, that series, I've been writing it on and off for about 15 years. It's something I've enjoyed enormously. There were 7 books. The most recent of them, as you know, was about 6 years ago, The Dungeon House. And then came the golden age of murder and the British Library crime classics, and then these golden age novels that we've been talking about, Gallows Court and Mortmain Hall. So for those reasons, I've been away from the lakes for quite a long time as a novelist, although I've kept visiting and kept thinking about ideas. And in that time, I've been thinking about the development of the characters, Hannah Scarlett and Daniel Kind, and where I wanted to take them. And as Anne has been saying, it's very important to keep fresh, to keep excited about the characters and the situation you're writing about, because if you're not excited, the readers won't be. And after that long break, I really enjoyed not just the research, but actually writing about the characters and getting back into the vein of a different sort of story, because Mortmain Hall and Gallows Court are very, very different books from the Lake District mysteries. And each of the Lake District books in themselves is I think, quite distinct. I always try to write each individual novel a little bit differently. And so there is an element as you know, Barbara, having helped enormously with the editing, there is an element of psychological suspense, perhaps more so than in the previous books. In fact, I'm sure it's more of a factor, and there's less of the investigation. There's a lot about the internal relationships within the police team, as we were discussing earlier, but it's a different sort of Lake District Mysteries, and it was a book I enjoyed writing enormously, and it's called The Crooked Shore, and all being well, it'll be coming out sometime in 2021.
Well, I certainly hope so. You know, I realize that neither one of you, I haven't given you a moment to talk about the book at hand. So, Anne, if you wanted to tell us a bit about The Darkest Evening, what would you say?
I would say that it starts off with Vera coming home from work in a blizzard, and it's a cold book. It's cold in all sorts of ways, and just a lapse of concentration, or because the snow is so thick, she loses her way and finds herself going down a narrow road with a forest at one side and a dry stone wall on the other, and the snow is getting thicker, and she's worried about where she is and whether she'll get home, and sees a car pulled into the side of the road and thinks there's been an accident because of the weather, gets out to investigate, and the driver's door is open, and she just assumes that the driver has gone to get help or to find phone reception, cell phone reception. But then hears a cry, and there's a toddler in the back seat. And she puts the toddler in the car with her and drives on looking for habitation, for somewhere to stop and let everybody know what's going on, and comes to Brockburn, which is the big country house of the novel, and recognizes it because that's where Hector, her father, grew up. And Hector has haunted Vera throughout all the books, I think. He was a neglectful, not terribly good husband, good father. And so going back to his home brings back all sorts of memories and all sorts of complications for her in investigating the case. And of course, there's a murder.
Well, Vera's always been an unconventional character, but I thought it was tremendous fun to read about her father as a classic black sheep sort of, son of an aristocratic family. I mean, so, we get to learn a lot about him, even though he's dead and gone.
Yeah, I think that's what, I think it was Andrew Taylor who talked about writing as a sort of psychological archaeology. We go back into people's past to find out what makes them who they are today. And certainly that's what I love to do in the books. Go back through the generations and see what leads to who people are now. And Hector, yeah, he would have been all right if his wife had lived, I think. He married a bit below him, the village school teacher, and she died when Vera was very young, and he was left with this child that he had no interest in, still grieving for a wife who had died. And I think the poor relationship between father and daughter continued throughout his life.
Well, it certainly, it's also a psychological excavation of Vera and who she is.
Yeah.
Once we start reading about her father and that relationship. So I thought it was wonderful. I mean, I often find that authors like to write prequels if they've written a long running series, but I thought this was an extremely interesting way that you didn't write a prequel, but you did write, early Vera and Vera's family in a way that perhaps a prequel would have allowed, but this was a different way of doing it.
Yeah, I think a prequel of looking at Vera probably wouldn't have brought that family in, because once she was old enough to leave, and she became a police cadet at 16 and left Hector and the family behind, but was still very much haunted by that background. And so we learn perhaps a bit more about her very early years than we would if I were writing about her as a young police officer, a police constable in the 80s. So
well, you're the only person. You're the only person who knows her well enough to do that. So, it's so interesting over the years. I don't mean this to sound morbid, but over the years, because the bookstore is going to be 31 in October, so it's been a long time. I've observed fans reacting to the end of a series or the demise of the author. And it's not that they really mind that the author has left us, but what really upsets them is the character has died alongside. And I think particularly with a long series, that becomes, I'm just telling you, that's how people are. I mean, it's a fascinating study.
It's quite interesting that that when the TV show first started, Brenda Blethyn, the actress who plays her, wanted that back history. Because of the way she'd worked, she worked with director Mike Leigh on Secrets and Lies and other things. And his way of working with actors is that they should know very much the back history, even though it never appears in the film. And so I was asked by the director to write who Vera's family were, where her father had grown up, who her mother was. And so actually Brenda knows those things as well as I do. And I think that comes over very strongly in the portrayal, and to have an actor who's willing to put that sort of work in is joy, and not that common, I think, in commercial television.
Well, and it has been, how many seasons has Vera been running?
10. So they're just starting to film season 11 on Monday.
And even that's unusual because so many series really die out at series 6 or something, and then it's very hard to push one to the number of years that Vera has been playing. Do you think Brenda has part of that she's so
very
wonderful?
Much, I think. Yeah, she's a double Oscar nominee. She's a classy actress and loves doing it. Absolutely loves coming up to Northumberland and doing it. So that certainly helps, and it's a great money maker for ITV and for the UK, really, because I think Vera is sold to 200 different territories. So wherever you are in the world, if on some strange download channel in a hotel room, you're likely to get an episode of Vera turning up. And I think the fact that there are only 4 episodes each season helps as well, because people don't get tired of it. It's a kind of event when there's a new season of Vera, because there are only 4 episodes.
Right, 6 seems to be a fairly common denominator, 6 and 8. You're right, 4 would certainly leave people. I thought it was interesting that the new Morse, the Endeavor, was only 3. And they've also taken, do you remember Nicholas Freeling and his wonderful Vandeventer books? Yeah. They've shown 2 and there's 1 to go. But again, it's only 3.
And it's nothing like the books. Nicholas Freeling is such a brilliant author, and the TV show was absolutely nothing like the books.
Very true. And it's a little odd to see characters with wonderful British voices wandering about in Amsterdam. But I have the same reaction to the Donna Leons. They're filmed by a German company. So instead of Venetians, we have German actors portraying Brunetti and all the cast, which I think is a rather odd thing. Martin, tell us a bit about Mortmain Hall, or maybe you should start with Gallows Court, and because Mortmain Hall is the sequel. They're just the 2 so far for Rachel.
Yeah, yes, that's right. And I'm currently thinking about book 3, which is occupying me during the recent weeks of the pandemic. So that's been fun. I suppose in many ways, the challenge I set myself with Gallows Court was to write the type of golden age thriller that Dorothy L. Sayers, who didn't really approve of thrillers, might grudgingly have accepted as sufficiently engaging and appealing to be acceptable. And that was a book that introduces Rachel Savanake, a mysterious young woman who arrives in London with a small entourage of three people who are devoted to her. She's young, she's fabulously wealthy, and we soon find out in Gallows Court that she's extraordinarily ruthless. And a young journalist called Jacob Flint, a young Yorkshireman who's come down to London, and has become a crime reporter, becomes fascinated by Rachel and the way she involves herself in a series of rather bizarre murder mysteries. And so he sets himself a task of trying to find out what her agenda is. And that's the idea of Gallows Court. That was a book, because it was a different sort of book for me, a real departure from what I'd written previously. For once, I didn't plan it at all. I didn't know what was going to happen, and it took as a result quite a long time to write. But I was excited with the result, and excited as well that the publishers wanted a sequel. So Mortmain Hall was always going to be a very different sort of book. The challenge I set myself this time was to write a detective story, very much in the classic vein, but not a conventional pastiche whodunit, a book with something more to it. So there are lots and lots of clues and various suspects, but there's a mystery about what the puzzle is really all about, and a whole series of enigmatic events that take place, starting with a murder committed on the Necropolis Railway, which was a real thing in 1930s Britain. There was a funeral train that ran from central London at Waterloo into Woking in Surrey, where there's a huge cemetery. And that was an idea that began in the 1890s, and by 1930 the funeral train was very well established, but a murder is committed in chapter 1, and that sets the story going. But we know from an early stage of the story that there's a place called Mortmain Hall, and that there's something that connects a number of people who've been involved in murder trials. They are in some way linked with Mortmain Hall, but we don't know why or what the issue that connects them really is. So the quest that Rachel is undertaking with Jacob's slightly reluctant help is to find out what the secret is of Mortmain Hall. And ultimately there is this, as you've described it, Barbara, this kind of Edgar Allan Poe type decaying country house on the cliffs of North Yorkshire, where the final answers to the mystery are revealed. But because I was interested in the idea of doing something unusual with the classic detective story, the book begins with an epilogue which discusses the idea of the perfect crime, which is a very important theme of the book. And right at the end of the book, there's something called the clue finder, which was something you found in a number of books in the Golden Age, both British detective stories and American detective stories. And the idea of the clue finder was that the author must play fair with the reader. And because the clues were going to be set out in the clue finder, you're going to be given page references to the clues. It was a kind of discipline to the author to make sure that the reader had all the equipment to enable them to solve the mystery if they could. And so I was very attracted by the idea of the clue finder. I think it's a lot of fun. And in the end, the clue finder in Mortmain Hall has 34 clues. And it's interesting to talk to readers to see how many of them they pick up. I hope that many of them have been sufficiently concealed in the story that what's happening is far from obvious, but the clues are all there if you want to find them. So there are lots of elements of this story that derive from Golden Age detective fiction. It's kind of love letter, if you like, to Golden Age detective fiction, but done, I hope, in a fresh and unusual and intriguing way. That's the idea behind Mortmain Hall.
Well, both of you have published to enormous critical acclaim, and one hopes also commercial success, which after all is important as well. I have one other question I wanted to ask you, and I don't want to keep you too long, but as authors who are published in more than one country, this always comes up with readers. they want to know if you have any control over A, your title, or B, the cover art and so forth. Martin, yours are quite different. The American covers and the Head of Zeus covers in Britain. But Anne's, interestingly enough, your design is slightly different in the US than the UK. The colors and all are very, very similar. So I don't have a UK one to show you because we sold them all, but side by side, they look relatively similar.
I think that's possibly because my English and US publishers are all part of the same publishing house. I'm with Pan Macmillan in the UK and St. Martin's in the US. And it's great because my former editor from the UK is now my editor in the US. She got headhunted by Minotaur. So, and I only get one set of edits. Both editors come together and discuss the book and then feed me one set of notes. So that's really, I love that collaborative approach. It means that we can do cross-fertilizing with marketing and with all sorts of stuff, really. So it's very, very positive for me to have that great relationship between the two houses.
That is wonderful and relatively unusual. Do you generally suggest your own titles, or do you find that sometimes your publisher decides on a different one?
With The Darkest Evening, I'm trying to think what I was coming up with, and it was all around the Robert Frost poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, and I think I'd gone for something like The Deep Dark Woods, but of course that's been used quite a lot before, or something similar like Dark Pines and Into the Forest, and I think it was Catherine Richards, my US editor, who took another line, The Darkest Evening, and everybody said, oh yeah, of course, that's the one. So there is usually some discussion about titles, but and sometimes The Long Call was absolutely mine. The Long Call, which is the North Devon one, which I was very pleased with, which seemed to work well for that book. So yes, it's a variety, and it is the US and the UK editors and me that decide the title, with the two agents, Moses and Sarah, throwing their weight in as well. So there's usually quite a discussion.
It's often surprising how titles require a lot. And I have found over the years that the art on books often is the most divisive of all of the discussions, because everybody has a different image, of how the book should look. So Martin, I know that you and I, because we've edited all these books together, we've always agreed on your title. I've never asked you to change one.
No, that's true, Barbara. And for me, the title is really important and integral to the story. So I generally like to be very clear about a title and a distinctive title at an early point of writing the story, and I kind of build it into the story in various ways. So the first series I wrote, the Liverpool books, the titles all came from 60s pop songs, when pop songs really were pop songs. And each title reflected a theme, which is a theme of the mystery as well. The Lake District titles, like The Coffin Trail or The Arsenic Labyrinth, again follow a general pattern: The Crooked Shore, The Dungeon House, The Serpent Pool. And again, they because the Lake District series focuses much more on the landscape, the rural landscape, that they very often deal with place. So again, the title is pretty integral. With Gallows Court and Mortmain Hall, and the two titles which I have in mind for the next two books, which I better not mention just yet, but those titles also will follow a particular pattern, and so the titles are really integral. The artwork, on the other hand, is something that is quite different, because I'm not an artist. I'm not an expert in what sells a book in terms of jacket artwork. So there, whilst I'm very protective of my titles, and they're very important to me, the artwork, important as it is something that I like to get advice on from the people who know how to sell the books, because it's something that's outside my area of knowledge and expertise. So different publishers, and unlike Anne, I have different publishers in the States and UK and elsewhere. Different publishers will have a different vision for the way they see the jacket artwork, and with all of my books published in the States, the jacket artwork has been very different from the British artwork. I'm not quite sure why, but it is clearly a different market. So it's the publishers in each case have obviously geared their thinking about the design to what they think will work in their particular patch.
Well, it's fascinating. We import so many British books that we often have the opportunity to compare. And, it's fun to have customers come into the store and they will look at, the British edition and then the American edition.
Yeah.
And aside from the stunning difference in price, which is because books don't actually swim, but, have to cross the Atlantic, they're often fascinated by the vision that one publisher has for its market and another, and that's not even including foreign language publications and so forth.
Yeah.
So since you guys get your foreign language editions, I've often thought it must be for you to line them up and then see what each publisher has decided would work in your market. Well, I want to thank you for spending time with me today. It's really been a joy to talk to both of you.